You know, it's funny how some of the biggest divides on Earth aren't lines on a map, but sort of invisible natural barriers.
Oh, absolutely. Like the Wallace Line.
Exactly.
Mm.
In the Malay Archipelago, you've got islands there that look, well, geographically pretty close together.
Right next door, practically.
But biologically, they're harboring just astonishingly different plants and animals. It's like two worlds side by side.
Yeah, Alfred Russel Wallace pointed this out, didn't he? Way back in the 19th century. A really stark division.
And what's really kind of mind-boggling is that these straits between the islands aren't even that wide in places.
Not at all. Yet these fundamental differences in species have stuck around for millions of years. It really makes you ask, why?
Why the separation? Why haven't things mixed more, across this boundary that looks like it should be easy to cross?
That's the big question, the sort of central riddle we want to tackle today.
Right. Because we've been looking into some pretty fascinating new research. There's a study in Science especially.
Yes, offering some fresh ideas on why this line has been so persistent, so strong for so long.
So consider this your, let's say, quick download on some really key ideas about biodiversity and, well, what shapes it.
In this deep dive, we're aiming to unpack that whole interplay between, ancient climate changes, the different evolutionary roads species took.
And how just being geographically isolated kept the Wallace Line going.
Yes.
Its resilience is really something.
It is.
Okay, so let's properly get into this historical puzzle then. You have these islands, almost like stepping stones.
Visually, yeah.
Yet the life on one side is just completely unlike the life maybe just a short hop away on the other. Scientists have been puzzling over this for, what, over a century?
Oh, easily. More than 100 years trying to figure out why Australia's marsupials and unique plants didn't just spread all over Southeast Asia and, vice versa.
So this recent work you mentioned by Alex Keels at ANU.
Right, him and his colleagues, it's a really significant step building on all that previous work. Wallace himself drew that map back in 1863.
The map, yes.
And it's remarkably good, isn't it? Showing the closeness geographically, but highlighting that stark biological difference.
Seeing that map really does bring home the oddness of it all. Neighbors, but worlds apart biologically.
Yeah.
So what were the huge, Earth-level events that could cause such a deep split?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. Continental drift is key.
Okay.
Millions and millions of years back. When Australia finally broke free from Antarctica, that created a massive deep ocean pathway.
Right. Allowing that current to form.
Exactly, the Antarctic circumpolar current, this huge ring of cold water just circling the South Pole.
And that had global effects.
Massive global cooling effects. But here's the kicker, maybe the unexpected part. That cooling didn't hit species on both sides of the future Wallace Line in the same way. Their evolution went down different paths because of it.
Okay, so one big global event, but with really different localized biological results. That's fascinating. How did that evolutionary split actually happen then?
Well, think about Australia drifting south. It gets caught in that cooling trend. The climate there becomes gradually cooler and also drier over time.
Makes sense.
So Australian species evolved adaptations for those conditions, cooler, drier. Now contrast that with Southeast Asia.
Still sitting up there in the tropics,
Yeah.
warm, humid.
Exactly. It stayed tropical. So the recent science study, it really highlights this key point. Australian species adapted over ages to cool, arid environments they were at a disadvantage trying to move onto those tropical islands near the Wallace Line.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense intuitively.
Yeah.
It's like you wouldn't expect a desert animal to suddenly thrive in a rainforest. The basic toolkit is just wrong.
Precisely. And I think Alex Keels put it quite well, didn't he? He said something like,
Oh yeah, I remember the quote.
yeah,
They had evolved in a cooler and increasingly drier climate over time and were, therefore, less successful in gaining a foothold on the tropical islands compared to the creatures migrating from Asia.
that veils it, yeah. That quote really crystallizes the core finding. Those different evolutionary pressures, driven by geology and climate, they led to really deep biological differences.
Meanwhile, the species from tropical Southeast Asia.
They were already perfectly suited, pre-adapted, you might say, to the conditions on the western side of the line.
So even though things did move, sometimes birds flying across, maybe seeds drifting.
Sure, dispersal happens, but that basic incompatibility with the environment on the other side acted like a really effective long-term filter.
So it wasn't a solid wall, but more like a very selective barrier.
Yeah.
maintained by climate and evolution.
Exactly. That fundamental evolutionary divergence kept the two biological realms pretty distinct despite occasional crossings. It shows how powerful these ecological boundaries can become.
Right. Despite the odd traveler getting across, the differing environmental pressures and adaptations on each side just made it incredibly tough for species from the other side to really establish themselves, to integrate.
That's it. A persistent barrier to successful colonization.
Okay, so this gives us a great window into the past. But what about now? What about the future? We're facing this huge climate crisis.
A really critical question for today. Absolutely.
How does understanding the Wallace Line help us think about, species adaptation now and maybe conservation?
Well, the Wallace Line is like this huge natural experiment, isn't it? It shows us how long-term environmental shifts shape where species live and, crucially, their ability to move into new areas.
Okay.
And Skeels mentioned this too, didn't he? He said something about how this understanding...
Yeah, this could help us predict which species may be better versed at adapting to new environments as changes to Earth's climate continue to impact global biodiversity patterns.
Exactly. So by digging into why those historical barriers held firm, driven by climate...
We might get clues about which species today have the sort of flexibility or the right traits to handle the rapid changes we're seeing now.
That's the hope. It could point towards species with more inherent adaptability, which has obvious implications for where we might need to focus conservation efforts.
Makes sense. Target the ones that might struggle more.
Right. If we know what adaptations help Southeast Asian species thrive in the tropics, while similar Australian ones didn't, maybe that gives us some predictive power. Which species globally might have the plasticity to survive big climate shifts?
It really hammers home that key takeaway then. A species' deep evolutionary history, its ingrained adaptations, that's fundamental to whether it can cope when the environment goes haywire.
Absolutely fundamental.
Yep. Okay, so let's try and boil this down. The Wallace Line stayed strong for so long, mainly because continental drift kicked off major climate changes,
Check.
which then forced Australian and Southeast Asian species down totally different evolutionary roads,
Making them adapted to very different conditions. Yep.
creating this basic mismatch in their adaptations, making it super hard for them to successfully invade each other's territory.
That sums it up really well. It just highlights that profound link, doesn't it, between huge geological events, global climate, and, well, all the amazing life we see around us.
It really does. And it makes you think, with the climate changing so fast now, could we actually see these ancient lines like the Wallace Line start to weaken or shift?
A critical question. What happens if these long isolated ecosystems start to mix more freely because climate zones are moving?
Yeah, what are the knock-on effects for biodiversity globally? It's something to ponder.
It certainly is. The long-term stability of these major biogeographic patterns is definitely facing potential stress. How ecosystems react, that's a huge area of ongoing research.
And for all of you listening, especially if you're preparing for the UPSC exams, this deep dive really hits some key points, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely.
We're talking core principles of biogeography. Environmental science is obviously crucial here. And it's a perfect example of how past geological events shape today's biodiversity patterns. Relevant for prelims and mains, I'd say.
Couldn't agree more. The Wallace Line is a fantastic real-world case study. It shows how these big Earth system processes drive the distribution and evolution of life. That's foundational stuff for environmental studies, geography.
Absolutely. So, if you found this look at the Wallace Line as intriguing as we did, and you want more deep dives into the hidden forces shaping our world,
Please do let us know.
yeah, please like, subscribe, and maybe drop a comment. Any questions you have or just your own thoughts on the Wallace Line and what it means today. We really value hearing from you.
We do.
And just to mention, for anyone wanting to dig deeper, our chat today was informed by research covered in the India Defense Review.